Tax Course Number 2, Personal Return, Form 1040, Part 1. This is Ken Boyd, the owner of St. Louis Test Preparation. Here's our email and our phone number, and you'll also find us now on Facebook at St. Louis Test Prep. We're going to start off a long discussion of taxes with a Personal Return 1040. We're going to talk about page 1 and page 2 separately, and this is the sort of the skeleton or the big picture piece of a personal tax return that we will go into detail with in later courses. On page 1, there's really 3 or 4 things to talk about. The first is filing status, and for most situations that's married filing jointly. The significance of that is that there are different tax tables depending on if you're single, married filing separately, married filing jointly. That's the significance of filing status. The second is exemptions, and the way of thinking of an exemption is who lives with you, depends on you, who do you support financially. It's listed on page 1 and the financial calculations on page 2 of the 1040. As far as income, we look at income from all sources, not just the paycheck. You get income from investments, which might be interest, dividend, and capital gains, self-employment that we'll see for the example I have, and also income from pensions, IRAs, retirement plans. What we see at the bottom of page 1 are adjustments to income, which total up, the last line on page 1 is adjusted gross income. What I've done here is flip over to the actual 1040 tax return for 2009. And my example is an old client of mine, and I've called them Don and Cindy Dentist. This happens to be a dentist. Let's go over the same areas of the tax return that we covered on the PowerPoint. Here's filing status. It happens to be married filing jointly. Here's the exemptions. And you'll note that if you can be claimed as a dependent on somebody else's tax return, you don't get the exemption. It so happens that they have a son named Eric Dentist. So there are a total of 3 exemptions. We'll see more on page 2. Cindy Dentist happens to be a dental assistant, so she gets a W-2 for about $61,000. But the family has other income too. Taxable interest on investments, maybe from a bank, some tax exempt, mostly municipal bonds that are tax exempt. They have dividends on stocks, both ordinary and qualified, we'll define later. Line 12 is particularly important because this is the business income or loss. And we know that Don Dentist has a dental practice, and we're going to see more on Schedule C later. And Schedule C rolls up into the 1040. He has about $173,000 in business income. Besides interest and dividends on investments, we have capital gains and losses from buying and selling investments. Happens to be a $3,000 loss. Lines 15 and 16 are important because this has to do with income that you're getting from various retirement vehicles. Individual retirement accounts, IRAs, pensions, annuities. There's a little bit of income here. None of it for this taxpayer is taxable, and so it adds up to about $254,000 in income. We then take total income on line 22, and we make adjustments in this section, lines 23 to 37, to get down to the bottom of the page, which is adjusted gross income. The only one that applies for this taxpayer is 1/2 of the self-employment tax. We're going to see on page 2 that he has a Schedule SE where he calculates self-employment tax, which takes the place of the FICA and Medicare that's withheld if you get a W-2 from an employer. Half of that's deductible. That's how we get down to adjusted gross income at the bottom of the page. Flipping back to PowerPoint, let's talk about the big picture on page 2. At the top of the page, we get adjusted gross income, and then we have a deduction, whether itemized deduction or standard deduction. We have the economic impact of the exemptions. There happens to be 3 for this taxpayer, which brings us down to taxable income. So we go from adjusted gross income, which is AGI, to taxable income. That's the number that we figure tax on, and there's various types of tax, not just income tax, but also tax on self-employment and tax on retirement plans. Finally, at the bottom we have payments, and again, not just payments from that W-2 withholding that you have on your paycheck, but for self-employed people and people with higher incomes there may be estimated payments. And finally, credits. We define credits as a gift certificate from the IRS, so to speak, because a tax credit allows you to deduct for every dollar of tax liability, you can deduct $1 of that credit. Here's page 2 as it actually appears in the tax return. We have the adjusted gross income at the top, the $245,000 roughly. This taxpayer, because of their income level and limited deductions, takes the standard deduction because that turns out to be higher than the itemized deductions. You can see that married filing jointly happens to be $11,400 in 2009. The three exemptions that we had on page 1, we multiply each those by 3650 and we get $10,950 as an exemption deduction. So deductions less exemptions, those two numbers are subtracted from AGI to get $222,000 roughly. We use a tax table to calculate $51,000 in tax. This taxpayer has a small amount of alternative minimum tax, which we'll talk about later. So here's his tax liability from income. But we have to throw into that an additional self-employment tax, which again takes the place of FICA and Medicare withholding. It's on Schedule SE we'll discuss later. That's about $18,000. So if we look at the taxpayer's entire liability, it's about $70,000. And they handle the payment of that before the tax return two ways. Some of this money, $5,300, was withheld on the W-2 for the dental hygienist's wife who had got a W-2 form. And then our dentist sent in about $63,000 in estimated payments. So of the $69,000 odd tax, he's already paid nearly $69,000. He has a remaining liability of about $1,000. That's the end of tax part 2. You'll see two topics, essential topics in management accounting and also cost accounting, two courses that are 3 hours total. They're 1 hour each in GoToMeeting.com, so you can get a much longer perspective on some of the things we teach online. Our YouTube channel, Ken Boyd STL, all one word. For individual live one-on-one tutoring and chat sessions, stltest.net is our website where we have a listing of our videos in Excel. Here's our email address and our phone number, and we'll see you next time to continue the discussion on personal taxes.